All right, so we are going to get started. Looks like we have a very good audience size. So I'm going to hand it over to Max Pensky, who is one of our co-directors, to give a brief introduction.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. From wherever you're joining us from today, it's a beautiful fall morning here in upstate New York. As Sarah said, my name is Max Pensky. Along with my colleague Carrie Wiggum, I'm one of the two co-directors of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, which is based at the State University of New York at Binghamton in Binghamton, New York. IGMAP, as we call it, and Binghamton University are situated on the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, and in particular the Onondaga and Oneida nations, and we acknowledge our presence on their ancestral homelands. We are delighted to bring you this, what looks like it's going to be a great discussion for you this morning here in New York. I'm going to shortly hand things over to our new colleague here at IGMAP, Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, Chris Davey. Chris has gathered authors and contributors to a new volume that he's edited, Teaching Peace Amidst Conflict and Postcolonialism. It is an extraordinarily rich and diverse and powerful set of studies. I'm very much looking forward, Chris, and our other guests, to hearing about this new work and your perspectives on the project. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris Davey, who will be able to give you in the audience a sort of a roadmap to the book, introduce the co-authors who have joined us here today, and hear about their work. So, Chris, again, thank you for this great project. It's a delight to host you here at IGMAP for this event, and over to you.
Thanks, Max. And I'm very grateful for my colleagues helping facilitate and host the discussion today. So we're here to talk about a recently published book that all of us have been involved in, Teaching Peace Amidst Conflict and Postcolonialism. This is what the book looks like. I'm joined today by some of the chapter authors of the book. And the book itself looks at 10 countries which are case studies of peace education in either or both scenarios or environments where conflict or post-colonialism are sort of key features of culture, life, and society. This book began as a project and is a project that sort of originated with Education for Global Peace. And Education for Global Peace is an organization that myself and some of the other authors are involved in. And Education for Global Peace, we are an international NGO that are working towards envisioning a world where nonviolence, justice, and peace characterize our everyday interpersonal relationships, communities, cultures, societies, and states. We do a lot of work. You can find our website, and we'll pop that here in the chat in a little bit. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do, please get in touch with us. But for our purposes today, we're focused on the contributions that our authors made in the book, and just some of the big takeaways and some of the lessons learned for both practitioners in peace education, but also those who are researching peace education. And we're also interested in the ways in which this book can help shape policy, as well as activity in the classroom. So I'm going to just introduce very briefly each of our authors with their name and the country that they've been working on in the order that you might have seen on the poster. And what we'll be doing is hearing just a brief 2-minute headline from each of our authors. And these authors are then going to engage with me. We're going to have a big discussion about some of the key questions that are raised in the book. And those questions are loosely articulated as follows. The main one is, can peace be taught where the scars of war and legacies of colonialism are entrenched in society? And if so, how? The other 3 questions are sort of sub-questions of this, right? And the second one deals with what or who are the actors involved in shaping peace education? And thirdly, how are peace education initiatives defined as peace in political life? And then to what extent is peace education being mobilized for positive peace. Throughout our book and then throughout peace scholarship, there's this important distinction between positive and negative peace. And our book, very much using the model of Paulo Freire and many other peace scholars, focuses very much on this notion of positive peace, not just the absence of violence, but the construction of new kinds of society, new kinds of relations that build peace in collaborative and productive ways. So, with that being said, I'm just going to introduce now our authors. Firstly, we have Michael Minch, who's written our chapter on Northern Ireland. And then we'll be hearing briefly from Maria Paula Unigaro Alba and Tatiana Mosquera Angulo, who have written our chapter on Brazil. And then we'll hear from Mercedes Somosierra, who's written on Uruguay. And then we'll be hearing from Kara Huza, who's written about Burundi. And then we'll be hearing from Rajib Timalsina, who has written about Nepal. And then we'll be hearing from Maria Nisanka, who has written about Sri Lanka. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Phil Gittins, who's written about Bolivia. So I'm going to turn it now over to Michael, and we'll go through in that order, hearing just a brief 2-minute headline on your thoughts on this conversation and on your contribution in the chapter. So, Michael, I'll turn it over to you first.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here and so appreciative of the university hosting us and for the book itself. I wanted to contribute a chapter on Northern Ireland because Northern Ireland is both a post-colonial site where there's been a lot of peace education, and some Republicans would say it's not entirely post-colonial. It is formally a part of the United Kingdom, and that means that Britain still has a kind of ownership in Northern Ireland, which the Republican cause has sought to end for many, many generations. So, Britain, of course, colonized Ireland, and over the years, most of Ireland managed to find its way to independence. But in the northern parts of the island, where British citizens who had an allegiance to the crown and understood themselves as British, not Irish, where they were a majority, that part of the island became Northern Ireland and part of the United Kingdom as it remains. And of course, it continued to fester conflict. In the 1960s, when much of the world was undergoing a post-colonial revolution and colonial masters were being shaken off, and people who had been subjected to colonialism were finding independence and freedom. That did not happen for the Catholic, nationalist, Republican members of Northern Ireland, insofar as they were very significantly discriminated against in terms of housing, in terms of employment, in terms of education, in terms of policing, and so on. And so the conflict in 1968 grew particularly violent, and a 30-year war commenced, colloquially called the Troubles, in a phrase of vast understatement. And many people were killed for the size of the geography and the population. And in 1998, a peace agreement was struck, and known as the Belfast Accord or the Good Friday Agreement. And there has been a remarkably stable peace in Northern Ireland since then. Now, there's still violence there. There are radical factions both in the Republican community and the loyalist community who still perpetrate violence. But on a world scale, a global scale, and a historical scale, that violence is quite minimal, and the peace agreement has had profound effect in a very positive way. And so out of that and connected to that peace has been a lot of peace education that has emanated from NGOs, religious groups, external parties, and the state itself inside of Northern Ireland. So people come from all over the world to study the peace building process, the peace process, and peace education in Northern Ireland because it's so rich. But it's not perfect. There needs to be, and here I'll close my remarks, there needs to be an inventory of all the peace building and peace education activities in Northern Ireland so people know what's going on. A lot is going on, but there's no analysis of it. There's no picture of it. There's no accounting of it. There needs to be greater integration between what NGOs and religious organizations are doing inside of Northern Ireland with what the state is doing. And there's tension at times and there's cooperation at times. The tension needs to be overcome. The cooperation needs to be built, scaled up. Partnership needs to develop. And the last thing I'll say, and most importantly in terms of this integration that needs to take place, in Northern Ireland, public education still remains fundamentally binary or divisive, which is to say that almost all public schools are in effect Protestant unionist schools, and most Catholic or nationalist Republican families send their children to Catholic schools. And in my view, in the view of many people, until the education of Protestant and Catholic unionist and nationalist children and youth are fully integrated, you really will not have the kind of peace education and the kind of peace and reconciliation that Northern Ireland deserves. Thank you.
So Maria Paula, will pass over to you and Tatiana now.
He's on mute, we can't hear her.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we go.
Okay.
There you are.
Sorry for that. No, thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you, Chris, for hosting this space. And maybe I can take the lead on behalf of Tatiana and Juan Felipe, who's not here with us, but also co-authored the chapter on Colombia with us. And basically what we did was to focus on very, very recent Colombian history, and we studied the implementation of the Chair of Peace, which is a course that is mandated for all public schools to implement, and basically has as purpose to create a space for learning and reflection about a culture of peace. This course was mandated starting 2015 in a very complicated context in which we were having peace negotiations with the FARC guerrilla in the country, and there was like a lot of interest from the government to gain more support for the peace process. And then what we did was to study how this law was implemented by the schools, which were the guidelines given by the government, what were the schools doing, and then also how non-governmental organizations and institutions and international organizations jumped in also in the process. And very briefly, I can say that maybe some of the most interesting aspects that we found is that peace education was being taught very differently in the cities as in the countrysides. So in the cities where there were less armed actions during conflict in Colombia, it was really focused on school mediation, how to coexist together in schools, like conflict transformation, and more dialogue skills for students. In the countryside, where the conflict has been mostly lived and where armed actions have taken place, peace education has been focused more on historical memory, reconciliation, really talking about the conflict, what has happened, and how can we heal the wounds. And then in terms of how this has happened overall, we saw that the government has given general guidelines and somehow freedom from schools to implement this share of peace, but not enough resources and not enough support. So there has been really a lot of doubts from like the side of teachers, students, on how this process looks like, should look like. And then we have had international organizations and NGOs trying to somehow fill up this vacuum, but still working on a project logic, so not being able to provide further continuity. That's what we've seen so far in the case of Colombia.
So Mercedes, I think we're over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Max, Sarah, and Chris for making this meeting possible. I'll be reading a very brief summary on my chapter on Uruguay. The Oriental Republic of Uruguay is known as the most solid democracy in Latin America. It is in many respects a model society with a high level of democratic coexistence. Still, there are challenges on the path to peace education. 50 years have passed since the country suffered a dictatorship that violated human rights, and ever since the return of democracy in 1985, the country has tried to find a path to healing. As a healing tool, peace education took the shape of human rights education and citizenship building. But because of rising political polarization and radicalization and the contending worldviews among citizens, peace education has become a very politicized issue in the country. Peace education may have become a prisoner of politics, which makes the task of educating for peace harder and slower. And I'm looking forward to discussing this with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mercedes. Cara, I think we're over to you.
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, great. So my chapter focused on the case study of Burundi. This is a country in the Great Lakes region of East Africa, neighboring Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania. And basically what I trace in this chapter is the role of civil society in delivering peace education programs, particularly in the midst of what has become some pretty serious government backlash against civil society. So most peace education programs in Burundi are delivered through NGOs, and NGOs are increasingly existing within not just the typical competitive field that most NGOs find themselves in, trying to scramble for funding, but also that there's always this risk that they could be just simply kicked out of the country, which has increasingly occurred in the past few years. So I'm interested in what sort of peace education programs are deployed in this atmosphere. So when the government is watching closely, and where, in the case of Burundi, the ruling party has been openly hostile to civil society in recent years, up to and just after the 2015 elections. The government ousted a large number of NGOs, particularly those with ties to international actors and funders. And for folks on the call who know anything about NGOs, they almost all have ties to international actors and funders. And so that meant that a lot of people that were delivering those programs on the ground were either feeling very much at risk or were already kicked out. And so the ones that remain are quite concerned about their ability to stay in the country and continue to do the work that they do. So that's this atmosphere in which they operate. And so basically what I explore in the chapter and what I find in the midst of civil society's fear, this risk of being kicked out, attacked, and persecuted, that there's a particular brand of peace education that has flourished. And this is what the literature calls indirect peace, indirect peace education model. And it essentially means that programming both peace education aimed at children, which there's quite a bit of in Burundi, and also peace education aimed at adults, community programs and such, that they emphasize things like the right tools for nonviolent communication. So this focus on an indirect model is on building a set of skills, how to be empathetic, how to be morally righteous, how to think critically. And it embraces a lot of the language Chris brought up, a positive peace in terms of building stronger communities and interpersonal relationships. But the major highlight that I make in the chapter is that this model does some things really great. It gets people talking, playing with one another across traditional conflict divides, and it places this great emphasis on learning to understand others' perspectives. But it also means that there's this huge elephant that sits in the room, because no one talks about actual experiences of conflict and violence, or the root causes of violence that have occurred in Burundi in the past and in very recent years, and how these experiences impact folks' lives today in really tremendous ways. So I make the case in the chapter that there's this really large gap between the skills that indirect peace education builds up, and then the silence and the pain that sits within and between people about their very real experiences of war and trauma that are left undiscussed. And so that's where I'll leave my little blurb.
Thank you. Roger, can we come to you next, please?
Thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm Rajapti Malsina. I'm Assistant Professor of Conflict, Peace and Development Studies based in Kathmandu. So I'm talking about the Nepal in this book. And mainly I think there are 2 points very important for Nepal to know. Nepal was never colonized, but still it has a lot of colonial footprints. For example, we are supplying soldiers for British for last 200 years. As a British Gurkha, many of you know. That's why I found most of our school system and our books, they glorify violence or kind of fight or war because they want to produce more soldiers. So I always see our school system is colonial project. And if you see Nepal, it has talked about ancient root spirituality a lot in its curriculum. Especially we have value education, moral behavior, civic educations highly dominating in the schools and colleges and high school curriculum until we had the Maoist conflict in 1996. So after 1996, when we had the 1 decade long armed conflict, I saw a lot of non-state actors and state actors focusing on 2 kinds of peace education. One is teaching about peace, like introducing about peace, having consciousness about peace. And another one is focusing on teaching for peace. So trying to create mutual respect or kind of because we have 2 major issues. One is structural violence. It's still deep rooted, because it's not colonized, but we can see the ancient traditional practices, a lot of patriarchy and kind of casteism, untouchability. There are so many issues deeply rooted there. And at the moment, if you see right now in Nepal, we have, I think I would highlight 3 points. One is geopolitics. We are just neighbor to China on the northern side, and we have India on the southern side. The US, India, Australia, they're having the Indo-Pacific alliance, and China is making another alliance. So we can see big challenges, a small country between the 2 giant countries, how to have that. We can see that geopolitical factors in our school system, in our education. I think it's kind of new colonial projects coming in the world. And another one, I think, the structural violence, which already exists. And also another point, Nepal in the center of Asia, for example, Kashmir, Tibet, Myanmar, all our disturbing areas in Asia are just less than 200 kilometers away than us. And we have all the effects from those. So I think Nepal should prepare more on nonviolent communication, consciousness, and preparing our people more about having conscious peace education. That's kind of my takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you. Marie?
Sorry, get my voice on. Thank you so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Marina Sanka, the author of the chapter on peace education in Sri Lanka. So, as most people know, Sri Lanka faced a 30-year civil war, followed by episodes of violence like anti-Muslim riots and the 2019 Easter Day bombings. And recently, with a severe economic recession, people openly challenged government narratives. And we saw thousands of people of different backgrounds taking to the streets, conducting nonviolent protests. And this is honestly a first time for Sri Lanka that a protest has ever been nonviolent. So peace education gained traction in the early 2000s, driven by humanitarian aid and donor requirements. So NGOs received funding to create grassroots peace education programs in the war-torn north of the country, which does not solve the problem, as it leaves issues like prejudices and bigotry unaddressed in mainstream schools. However, from 2005 onwards, the government asserted greater control in conjunction with international consultants and donors. And there were attempts to standardize peace education through civics and citizenship education from grade 6 to 11 in the mainstream curriculum. So while interethnic contact remained low between Tamil and Sinhalese students, the curriculum attempted to promote values such as nonviolent conflict resolution, information about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and concepts related to democracy, for example. And most of the discourse was censored and age appropriate, and of course the textbooks avoided discussing the details about the root causes of the war. And this is actually not common for most countries going through a civil war, and even post-conflict nations. They stay away from controversial issues in general. And there were also several challenges with teacher training. Distribution of the textbooks was unequal. The rural areas didn't get equal access to the material. And unfortunately, civics was not a compulsory subject from grade 10 onwards, which defeats the purpose of the curriculum, because most of the pertinent topics related to the judicial system and injustices were alluded to in those later grades. And I also discuss more transformative projects, such as Think Equal. That's a UK model currently being developed in primary schools, promoting gender equality, and also Sri Lanka Unites, which is essentially an intercontact group promoting reconciliation. And since then, it has actually grown to a community of over 20,000 young people from various backgrounds. And I have seen plenty of their seminars online on topics like nonviolent communication. And many young people say that they have made close friends from people from different ethnic groups and religious backgrounds, who they would otherwise not have the opportunity to meet. So this is truly transformative, amazing work. And in a nutshell, I really do believe that civil society who wants to change can definitely transform a nation with a war-torn history, but this change is generational. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. And Phil, last but no means least.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to everybody for joining us, and huge congratulations to all the other authors as well. It was wonderful to be part of this project. So Andreas and I looked at the context within Bolivia, and we covered a whole range of different things within the chapter, but what I'll focus on now is two things. One is the context of Bolivia, and then a second thing, I think one of the most important things from the chapter is recommendations in terms of, well, okay, what can we do with this? Some of the things that we speak about in the chapter are very specific to the Bolivian context, and some of the things that we speak about, some of the ideas contained in the chapter might travel and speak to other contexts. So when we're looking at Bolivia, it's worth bearing in mind that Bolivia has the first indigenous president within the region, in some ways really kind of leading the decolonization movement, sweeping across the region and beyond. So from a positive point of view, they've done great work with regard to that. But that's not to say it's not without its tensions. There's huge tensions, and there's a reason why we called part of the chapter between decolonization and globalization, because there's tensions, between those, and there's tensions between the left and the right, etc. And some of those we talk about within the chapter. One of the arenas where this tension often plays out in Bolivia is education, which, if you follow the political rhetoric, is seen as a motor of change within Bolivia to really push forward their ideas of decolonization and self-determination and things like this, not just within Bolivia, but within the region more broadly. That's on one side. But on the other hand, it's been argued with research as well that often education is seen as really a driver of conflict within Bolivia. So you've got those two kind of tensions playing out. What Bolivia tries to do, if you follow the policy formations and the policy documents, is come up with their own idea of, which in one way is great, idea of what education, and more specifically education towards a culture of peace, is the language that they would use, might look like, and what it should be called, using language such as vivir bien, which broadly speaking can be translated to the good life, etc. And I know Ecuador has their own kind of version of that as well. But again, that's not uncontested. What Andreas and I did was look at, well, how does this translate into practice? Is there any gaps between what the policy says and what really happens within classrooms or on the ground? And we found there's quite a lot of gaps. There is some wonderful, there's some good examples, but there's scattered examples. There's no real strategic kind of focus within formal education or informal, non-formal education in terms of the practice on the ground. So basically, there's a massive kind of disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality. So then what we thought, we use a case study in terms of looking at some of the tensions that play out within Bolivia, but how do we go about working through these tensions between decolonization and globalization? And we make an argument that education really at its core is about communication, it's about dialogue. And I think there's sometimes, especially within the peace building field, there's this danger of moving far too towards one side. I think it always has to be this kind of what we call in the chapter a creative tension between decolonization, between globalization. Some of the recommendations we put forward are looking at investment, inclusion, and partnership. So when it comes to investment, this is something that applies worldwide. We know that peace education is hugely underfunded. We know that peace is hugely underfunded. Take a look at, with my work hat on, the war system. The military are spending $2 trillion a year in terms of preparing for war, and a fraction of that goes towards peace. So lots more investment is needed in terms of peace education. That's not just within schools, but preparing people to train. The second one is inclusion. So while peace education should take place in schools, primary schools, kindergarten, right through to secondary and universities, it should also take place in community settings as well. And it should also take place people of all ages, right from young to people that aren't so young. And then finally, partnership. We can't do this alone. Schools need to engage with wider communities, with different donors, etc. So there really needs to be a kind of multi-pronged approach to trying to move forward the bar with regards to peace education in Bolivia, but actually more broadly. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to engaging with you all and some of the great questions you might have.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone, for your summaries. I know it's hard to summarize not just a chapter, but work that's gone on for a lot longer than just a chapter's worth for many of us. I also wanted to welcome one of our co-editors and the originator of the project, Chris Toffolo. Chris, do you want to just say hi? And I'd also like to turn to you first of all to address our first question. So this was sort of the big question asked in the sort of conceptualization of the book is, can peace be taught where the scars of war and legacies of colonialism are entrenched in society? And if so, how?
All right. Thank you, Chris. It's lovely to see some old friends and to see in person some authors whose chapters I helped to edit. as Chris said, this project grew out of Educating for Global Peace, which is an organization that is committed to trying to mainstream peace education. And the first book was really to look at how this was a volume before this one, which was how is peace conceived in different disciplines? If we're talking about trying to teach peace, is it always taught in a peace studies course, or how is it taught through an economics course or a political science course or an art course, or those kinds of things? And this project really grew out of the idea of should we be careful? We need to be careful for what we wish for, because we know the idea of mandating peace education, that vision would be interpreted very differently in different places. So then the question, can peace be taught in post-conflict, post-colonial societies, which is really where the work has been done by all these amazing authors in this book. I think, what comes from reading the chapters and listening to the presentations today is really this issue of politics can capture peace education efforts, and it happens everywhere in the world. It doesn't happen just in post-conflict or post-colonial societies. It happens elsewhere as well. And that's a really serious point to think about as we think about pushing an agenda where we are demanding peace education. Because as was mentioned in Burundi, it can be really captured by the state in ways, or there can be huge silences. So there can be a claim that peace is being taught, and yet certain parts of what would be part of a robust peace education program are just simply absent. And then they're harder to see that it's absent because officially it's being taught. So I think one way in which to think about this is to break it down into the things that were already brought up by the authors, the question of skills. What skills need to be taught in peace education? What about the role of critical thinking? In some countries, Rwanda was not mentioned, but there was a huge discussion in the post-genocide period of Rwanda where critical thinking was the way that many experts advised the government. And in the end, they decided not to go in that direction. They decided to go into a direction of, we're going to work on identity construction, reconstructing youth as we're all Rwandans now, which is a very different framing than a critical engagement with the history and pain of the country. So I think that those are some issues. And the question of lived experience. And I'd just like to shift to one other thing, and I'll be quiet then. The question of the sites at which peace education can occur. Several of the authors really dove into teaching it in the formal curriculum, government policy around that. But we know that is fraught. What was not mentioned was an important site is teacher training. What efforts are going on in different countries around teacher training? Because even if there's good policy, many teachers feel not prepared to either teach the topic or to deal with the fallout of what can happen when identities are deeply divided. What if students get upset? What if they yell at each other? All those kind of skills, especially in more traditional classrooms where teachers are more in a lecture mode as opposed to a participatory mode. So I think that's something that we really need to look at. And then, given that peace education can't always be taught in schools because of government policy or politics or those kinds of things, the idea of working through churches, working through civil society. But another thing where we might want to add to is projects of memorialization. At the community level is another way in which peace can be taught in sometimes in spaces where there isn't a lot of space. I'm thinking about a recent example from the United States. We've got a kind of a rising moment of divisiveness on race issues, and yet in Savannah, Georgia, we just had a success of renaming Calhoun Square, a notorious slaver, for a woman who was enslaved but moved forward and had an amazing life. So these kind of community projects, the process of getting things renamed or setting up a monument is an educational process in itself, as well as then leaving a tangible legacy, which can lead people to question. And with the internet, you can then raise questions like, memorial, what is this about, right? A curious person can go and teach themselves. So those are just a few things that came to my mind listening to all these amazing authors and their very serious work. So thank you for carrying forward this important research. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting issues here, and I'm glad, Chris, that you sort of expanded out for us, what we mean by sites and these places, and even who are the actors involved in that. So I'm tempted to kind of open it up at this point to see if anyone wants to comment on Chris's sort of kind of taking a conversation a step forward, or if you have any questions for each other as well. So I'm going to dare to open it up here and to see. Oh, Tatiana, please go ahead.
Hi, how are you? I'm so glad that I can meet everyone. Right now I'm in Colombia. I'm in like in a place that it's very teaching peace inside. So that's why I was like in a car, and then you see like a background of a of a tree, and right now I can be sitting. What Chris was saying and everyone was like talking about was the political the political element of teaching peace. And right now I think that that's so important in our country, in Colombia, because right now we have like two political views that are affecting the teaching of peace. That it's the peace accord that was the base of our article with Maria Paula and Juan Felipe. And right now, in the daily basis, there are like two societies: one that it's pro peace, and the other one that it's not pro peace. And it's very difficult to address the issues of teaching peace in another way that it's not the skills ones. Because if you don't have like the skill ones, and you are going to address topics as, for example, violence, for example, trauma, it's very, very hard for us as teachers or as informal teachers to do these processes. So the political element, as Chris says, for us in Colombia, it's a very heavy one. And right now, what we have seen and what we have placed in our article, that it's that we need to address that topic, that it's like it's an elephant in the room that no one wants to address, but it's very important. And also, what we have seen in the article is that not also is the political element, but also like the formal and informal education, that it's very, very important here in Colombia. For example, the teachers in the rural areas are a very important actor. But what we have seen is that other people are very important that are teaching some skills for peace that are not the formal ones in the school. But there are other people that are teaching our kids and our young people and also the adults some skills that are not for peace. So we need to address those topics, and we need to address that. And they are more powerful, for example. And I really love what Michael was saying about the religions group here in Colombia are very strong, but we are like políticamente correctos, like I don't know how to say that in English, and we don't want like the church to be involved, but that's not true. Churches
Sorry, Tatiana, it's politically correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah.
Almost.
Oh.
And I think that that's very harmful. That like we need all the help that we can get.
Thanks very much. We're going to go to Cara next, but I just wanted to mention two things briefly for those who are listening in online. Please feel free to drop in a question into the Q&A. We will be coming to you in the Q&A in a little while, probably about 20 minutes or so. And I just wanted to add just a brief comment going back to what a few of you have said, and then with Chris raising the case of Rwanda as well. For me, something that came out now as we're talking about it is really this core notion of identity, and how identity counts in terms of, who owns the story that is the content of the peace education, and then how identity then also shapes these spaces that we've been talking about also. So perhaps we can return to that, but Cara, will go over to you now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. I think what this question of can peace be taught is something that always feels a little bit prickly to me. And I think that when I think of the case of Burundi, it really illustrates it clearly for me why it feels so like, I don't know if I love that language of can peace be taught, because in Burundi, then it's been treated as peace is a skill set. And if you just have the right skills, if we can just train you on this right skill set, then you will have peace. And oftentimes that ends up meaning that it's Western interveners and Western programs and Western logics which enter these post-colonial spaces and say, you do not have the skills for peace, let us teach it to you. And I think in particular in Burundi, what this means is that there's a widespread vocabulary about peace on the ground in Burundi. And these programs are very effective at teaching that vocabulary. But I think what's needed is to give people the space to think differently, to be able to sit together and work through these wounds, right? To breathe and to find community and connection. And we're missing that in this skills training because we think we can hand people a set of skills that we have decided build peace, and that's going to fundamentally transform the community. And the reality on the ground, right, is that it's not as if Burundians lack the right education or they lack the right skill set. It's that their needs are sometimes more immediate, and the pain and the trauma that they carry within themselves is unaddressed and very real. And so how do we also work through that? This is what's really being sidestepped in a lot. And I hear it in a lot of the other chapters that people were talking about today, that it's being sidestepped in a lot of these cases, right? That it's, well, let's just hand them the right skills. Nonviolent communication training is everywhere. But what does it do to heal those wounds between people?
Phil, I would love to hear from you. I think you wanted to say something. And then for our other colleagues who've written with a particularly post-colonial context, or where existing traditional cultural values have informed peace education, I'd love to hear about that as well. But Phil, we'll go to you, please.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question around, can we teach it? And I think there's different people saying different things in the literature. I think broadly speaking, there's agreement within the peace education field and peace and conflict studies field that how we teach is just important as what we teach. So the form is just important as the content. That's one side. When I tend to think, although I didn't speak about it in the chapter, when I think about kind of peace education, some of the work that we do, we talk about the knowing, being, and doing. So the knowing is there is certain terminology that people need to know, perhaps, in order to engage in peace education, terminologies around what is peace, what is violence, what is conflict, what is power, etc. And some of those things, I think, can be learned and can be taught, I think. And then you've got the doing part. So it's all right to know things, but how do we go about doing the practice, getting the skills around, active listening, dialogue, and things like this. I think something that's less kind of looked at is the being part, the being part. So with I'm a psychotherapist by training, is how we go about being in peace. And I think that's probably the most difficult. That's the most lifelong. And actually Galton in one of his books kind of alluded to it, but doesn't lay it out in detail. He talks about peace education is more than a curriculum. And I think he's kind of alluding to the fact that it's not something, that can be taught. That's on one hand. On the other hand, though, I like to read other people which are quite controversial, which don't come from the peace education field. And there's one person in particular I like called Gert Biester. And he wrote a book called The Beautiful Risk. And he actually talks about education and educators, teachers should teach. They are not there to facilitate. They are teachers, and they have actually got things to impart to other people. So I love what you say there, Garrett, about what I found in Bolivia and all the other contexts that I've worked in, including, Argentina and other places in Latin America and different parts of the world. I don't think local communities are against outside ideas per se. I think they're against the the imposition of outside ideas. So again, it goes back to this idea of education, I think, at the core is about communication and is about dialogue. So there's part of an answer.
Thanks, Phil. I'll open it up again. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
If I may just briefly kind of piggyback on what Phil said, all of it I appreciated. At one level, in one particular way, I think it's a misbegotten question, kind of a dangerous and misleading question. Can peace be taught? Because in my view, and I do some of this work in my chapter, I think that all human beings are always engaged in what I call liturgies, formation processes at the mall, at a football match, at a family dinner, wherever you are in life, whatever you're doing, you're engaged in some kinds of processes, some kinds of encounters that give you information. And let's remember there's an important sub-word in the word information: formation. We're always being formed. We're always being informed and formed. And of course, everything important about being human is learned. Everything. And it doesn't, most of it doesn't happen through formal education, of course, but it still happens through some form of informal education. And so, how to be a more peaceable person and how to build more peaceable institutions and structures, just like being a more violent person or bigoted person or fearful person is learned, and how to build more fearful or violent institutions and structures is learned. So too, we learn how to build better human lives, more peaceable lives, even our own. Good parents are doing this all the time with their children. Religious organizations that are true to their roots are doing this all the time. And the question isn't, for me, whether peace can be taught. The question is, how do we do it? And it involves all those things. Trauma, people are traumatized, and their trauma has to be addressed, as was mentioned wisely. But how to address trauma is itself something we learn. Not necessarily through a textbook or a professor or a course, but through being an attentive, observant, caring human being. But you still learn it. So I want to focus on not the question so much, can we teach peace, but rather, how is it taught?
Thanks, Michael. We'll go to Rajib and then Maria Paula.
Thank you. I think I would like to just add some points on what Phil and Michael said. So here my point is not only about how, also why. It's very important. Like, for example, if we take, I think we can teach concept, knowledge, definitions, or if our focus is about teaching peers. So if we want to create more teachers, so those people who will further teach, further share those ideas to other people. But if we are preparing for like community, for example, we have communities where we want to produce the practitioners. It's all about, peace is about consciousness. So many times, now I see the difference between this concept, definition, knowledge with insights, realizations, or kind of like learnings. Sometimes, even without the formal setup, people might have insights or realizations or deep understanding of the values of peace, like without being in the formal classroom. Sometimes people might be in formal classroom, they are being taught for years and years about the ideas of peace, but they might not have that insights or relations or what they are to practice. So I saw like main point like here about his consciousness. Many times many times we put a lot of effort sometimes to make peace, or kind of like peacemaking, a lot of like efforts on educating about peace. But I read one book from I remember Dr. Doyle. He was talking about, if we educate about what is preventing peace, peace will come naturally. Sometimes like when peace is there, but we are like, there are so many hurdles or complications we are aiding, the structural violence or like so many things. Even in NVC, like when Kara was saying nonviolent communication, I found NVC is very powerful about emotions, understanding emotions, being conscious, and making people. So there we don't use the word education, peace education. We say practice, peace practice. We practice how we communicate, how we talk. So there are sometimes like there are so many dimensions. I think that's why I bring the question, not only how, like, but also why we need that, why we need to teach. That's why it depends on that. Thank you.
Okay, and maybe I just wanted to go back again to the how, because I do think that one of the most valuable things that I found in the case of Colombia and how the chair of peace was actually designed was saying, okay, we're not going to say as government or as country what each institution has to teach, which content has to be taught, but then we're going to allow each institution to design its own program, how peace education is conceived within each institution based on the needs of each community. Because even though we're the same country, each community has a different need and has a different way in which violence has been experienced, in which violence is lived, and in which conflicts can be transformed. So I think that that was super valuable. But again, to me, the main failure is that teachers and educators haven't found any support on how to implement peace education according to their needs. And as Chris was mentioning at the beginning, also there's a lack of training for the teachers on preparing them on how to implement peace education programs. So to me, the how really has to be a balance of what do the communities need, what is relevant to them in terms of contents and skills, because I mean, yeah, we can say that skills is the easy part to teach, but they're also relevant. But then also how we give them some guidance so that they can implement their programs. That's it.
Tatiana, please.
Only to build to complement what Maria Paula was saying. We think here, as Michael, that the real question is how. And about the question that Phil was saying is that here in Colombia, the key is not to say what we need to do, because we're tired that people that for other countries or people that are more experienced or have like no English or something tell us what to do. What we need then as communities, as Maria Paula was saying, is to acknowledge that we have our own ways and our knowledge. For example, when we work with indigenous communities, they have like a lot of strength about peace building. Of course, it's not like perfect, but they have like a lot of knowledge about that. And what is good about the La Cátedra de la Paz is that if you're an indigenous community, you can do as your knowledge told you, and that's something that it's important, as Maria Paula was saying. Another element that we find that it's so important is the role of women here in Colombia in the building peace process. That's key, of course, the teachers, but also the mothers, the grandmothers, because it has like a lot of power here in Colombia. And I think that that's something that maybe it's not that studying like the role of women in teaching peace. It's something that we really want to address in another article for another book. And finally, I think that the key here is to not to teach as like the big teacher that taught the students. It's more strengthen the capabilities and the skills that are here in Colombia. And as Phil was saying, it's more like a dialogical process that needs to be all the two parts of the dialogue needs to be strengthening the skills all the time, and we need to be very humble of our knowledge and be like an apprentice all the time as teachers and as students.
Thanks, Tatiana. In a moment, we're going to have or in a few minutes, we'll switch to some questions from the Q&A, and we'll go to Mercedes next. But I wanted to have a little bit of input from you all before we shift gears, just to think about impact. And I hate to use the word effectiveness, but I don't on the spot have one that's better right now. So what is it that you've seen or that you see in what others have said this morning in terms of what makes peace education effective, and how could we measure that? Would we be talking about impacts, and then furthermore about positive peace as well? So we'll come to that question in a moment, but we'll hear from Mercedes first.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, I just wanted to go back to some concepts. Cara was talking about this imposition of models, right, coming from abroad, and it instantly brought me back to John Paul Lederach's elicitive approach, right? So each experience in each country has been different. Their history has been different. And therefore, I think we should go back to that concept of the elicitive approach, to ask people intrinsically know what they need, because they know their history and what they have been going through for years. So that I mentioned that in my chapter too, because each country needs its own unique, specific formula, right? And going back to what Maria Paula and Tatiana were saying, there is much need in Uruguay too for teacher training in peace education. Teachers are not actually trained in peace education. Peace education in Uruguay is not actually called peace education, it's called citizenship building. And it has to do with, of course, with the country and how peaceful it is. And it has to do with its recent past of they're living a post-dictatorial life right now, right? So there is only one manual in Uruguay, and it has been issued by a group of Teachers for Peace, a movement of Teachers for Peace, but it's not mandatory. So it would be a great topic to further discuss in a new book. How do we teach how do we train teachers, for peace? How do we do it? How do we do it in different languages? Because relevant material in Spanish is not abundant, right? So that would be a great topic to discuss forward. Thanks.
Marie, please.
Yeah, great question. How do we know what works, right? And how do we know when and how peace education is effective and when it's not? And to be honest, it's I'm just going to speak for the context of Sri Lanka. It is very challenging on a macro level when you see a resurgence of violence time after time, and we can conclude, rightly or falsely, that the previous efforts have been in vain, and you don't see the impact if you see riots, after a bout of peaceful protests. But if you delve further to a more microcosmic generational level, I do see a change in the value structure of young people. Now, society is less polarized. People are more open to different points of view, and they don't get as nationalistic or as self-righteous as things were 20 years ago. So those are the indicators of change, which it's quite difficult to capture in an evaluation, right? Unless you do a behavioral type of survey. But there are plenty of small steps that you can actually see in terms of change of values, a shift in perception. greater empathy, a willingness to see the other person's perspective. And eventually, hopefully you would see reduced violence, and it's a tough thing because generations change and every generation comes with its own environmental and social issues, and people react in different ways. I'll stop talking now.
Thanks, Marie. Phil?
I think this is a really, really important question to ask ourselves, the fundamental question around, are we doing what we say we're doing, and how do we prove it? That's a fundamental question, If you look back at Galton when he first started, he kind of raised that question and said that basically we will be judged on to what extent we're able to reduce violence. That's one way of judging some of our work. I think when we think about impact, we can think of the layers of impact. So you've got layers in terms of impact for individuals. So this is people going through peace education. To what extent does it impact? To what extent does it influence their learning, their knowledge, their skills, their attitudes, their dispositions? I think there's some evidence around that, in terms of journal articles around, to what extent does peace education work? There's some evidence there. But obviously, we don't just want to stay with individuals. We want to try and influence others, So the next level of impact might be, impact for family, for communities, etc. And there's less evidence there to show that we're really making, an impact there. And then even broader, impact on wider society, impacts within, a particular state. To what extent do people going through a peace education program then go and influence? I prefer the word influence rather than change. Influence some of the things that are happening more broadly. So there's one reflection. I think in terms of impact as well, we have to think in terms of what you're doing, the Education for Global Peace. Think of a systems approach, a networked approach. I mean, look at the Global Campaign for Peace Education. They do a brilliant job in terms of culminating so many people together. And I think this is what is needed, because we're all parts of systems, and everybody doing their little thing does make a difference. However, our challenge in the global community is, how do we get all those other people doing these brilliant things in their localized way, in Sri Lanka, in Burundi, in Uruguay, etc., to build up to a bigger whole? That, I think, is part of the challenge moving forward.
Thanks, Phil. We'll go very briefly, if we can, to Mercedes and Michael, and then I'd like to turn to some of the questions that we have in our Q&A bank, please.
Thank you, Chris. Very briefly, I gave my chapter to my mentor before handing it in for his comments. And something that he said, going back to what Phil just said, is, how do you measure this? What are the metrics for this? And I stood, silent, because he's a very technical man. He's not a peace educator. So I was surprised, but it opened my mind to, I tried to give him an answer, but I found my answer was not satisfactory, even for me. I wasn't satisfied at my own answer. And going back to what Phil said about, I can't remember the word now, influence, I think we could use the word persuasion, right? How can we persuade others, right? It was used in the 80s a lot in my country by a former president. So not convincing, not imposing, but persuading, right? That's all. Thanks.
Michael, we'll hear from you, and then we'll go to the Q&A bit.
Okay, just very briefly to this very important question of empirical evidence and how you test it, how you evaluate it, and what it looks like. Of course, it is an extremely important question, as we've just heard. But I want to suggest that one primary testable variable for how effective we're being in building peace and doing the good work of peace education to that end is democratization. That is to say that when Galtung said, you know, the proof is in the pudding and how we actually create more peaceable institutions and people and societies and international organizations and so on, in the future will be the value of what we're doing here. Well, there was a period of time until quite recently where the world was becoming ever more democratic, which is to say more and more countries were becoming democratic, and all the empirical evidence shows they were becoming less violent as a connected reality to the democratization. The relationship between authentic, not formal, but actual people power is almost an analytical truth in terms of its positive correlation to peace and vice versa. And so that's something we can measure, and that's something we can engage in building. And of course, we all know that right now in the world, there is a profound retreat from democracy all over the place, across Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. And so it speaks to the way that we need to be ever vigilant and relentless in our efforts. But building a democracy in democratic ways, not violent ways, which is an oxymoron, is a handmaiden. Actually, it's a far more important relation than that. It's intrinsic to building peace and peace education. And that is a very concrete and material kind of variable that we can measure.
Thanks, Michael. I want to go to one of the questions. This one's from Jerome. And this question touches on a few of the themes raised by others and goes back to some of the comments that you all shared earlier in our time. And the question is this, is how can peace educators and teachers strike a balance between acknowledging the historical injustices of colonialism, and we might add conflict as well, and teaching the values of forgiveness and reconciliation to their students and the community as a whole? So I'm going to open that out, but maybe if oh, good, excellent, you put your hand up. Please give us
no
the answer.
awkward silences. Yeah, I think, Jerome, I think that is a really excellent question. And we've all touched a lot on, I think Chris set us off on this conversation of the role of teachers and the training of teachers. And in Burundi, so there's a couple of things that are happening in Burundi. And one is that peace education is not often happening in the school classroom. There have been some efforts here and there to implement some civic education in the classroom. Typically, there's piloting of it for a year or so, and then it disappears again. So most peace education, quote, trainers are not Burundian and come from outside Burundi to deliver trainings, and then they leave. And sometimes it's expected that they'll deliver, they call it a training of trainers. So they'll deliver trainings to a group of Burundians who are then expected to take that learning and deliver the same training to larger groups of Burundians. But it means it often has very little to do with actual teachers in the classroom. And part of the problem with attempts to implement it in the classroom gets back to these issues that Jerome is highlighting, because teachers were a target of violence during the widespread bouts of conflict that have happened in Burundi. And so there's a distinct fear on the part of teachers, especially, to maintain this silence around historical legacies of violence, around divides between different ethnic groups, because they can point to a very recent history that says that if they cross those lines and someone tells on them, that their lives are directly threatened. And so it's a difficult ask to make of Burundian teachers to say that you should be addressing these things in the classroom with children.
We'll go just in the order that I see. So Phil, and then Tatiana and Maria Paula.
Again, a really, really brilliant question is touching on kind of the, the temporal dimensions of peace education. What do we teach, or what do we look at? The past, the present, and the future. And if we look at the education system more broadly, I think there's a massive over-focus on the past, a massive over-focus. Not to say it's not necessary, it really is necessary, and probably less of a focus on the future-orientated kind of what world do we want to live in. Elise Balding, one of the mothers of the peace studies field, talked about this idea of future imaging and future imaging workshops, helping people to look at the future. If in the context of Bolivia, it actually come up in research that I did around the topic, and different people, because we're all different, we're human beings, we're all different people said different things. So for example, in the government there was a massive focus on young people, and people in education need to look at the past, 500 years worth of discrimination and marginalization, etc. We need to look at the past. And then, okay, which is very valid. Then I was speaking to the UN, and other people had different kind of versions. But I'm telling you now, from empirically testing this on the ground, speaking to young people, they were adamant that yes, okay, we need to look at the past, but okay, we've had enough of it. We want to focus on the future now and move forwards. Let's focus. There's too much of a focus on the past. So again, it comes down to this dialogue and this communication and who you're working with, I think. I remember just one thing on this, actually, because it's come up quite a bit in terms of this. I co-wrote the chapter, and I'm obviously an outsider. I'm not, a Bolivian. I remember doing some research in Bolivia and actually having an interview with one of the directors of gender in Bolivia. And she said to me, even before starting, she said, kind of quote, "Phil, I'll tell you now, I'm a Marxist, I'm a feminist, and I'm not interested in traveling scholars coming here, interviewing me, then writing up the research that I will never ever see. I'm not interested in that." So I was like, okay. And then I started, working with her and developing. And after a bit, she asked me, "So what do you know about Bolivia? How long have you been here?" And then I told her, and I think there's a massive difference because I've lived there on the ground for a long time. I'm married to a Bolivian, and her kind of view of me just totally changed. Many people are sick and tired of people kind of flying in for a couple of days and doing interviews saying thank you, and then writing up the research and never letting them know. So basically I worked with her and said, well, okay, how can we make this research, accessible in a way? And she said, what would be really cool if you could produce a report, for my colleagues in terms of your findings. And could we do, I don't know, a co-organized conference to kind of, share the research as well. So that's what we did. So again, it was about this communication and this dialogue thing. So thank you.
I think Phil say it all, but I'm going to add some ideas. In Colombia, we have like a lot of good experiences about teachers making reconciliation. For example, I used to work with a group of teachers in a region that it's called Catatumbo, that it's a very hard war zone. And for example, the teachers have like their own experiences about losing people because of the armed groups, and they have to teach the kids of these armed groups in the school. So this type of very emotional and close spaces, this is a very good opportunity for reconciliation. Schools are a very good experience of reconciliation. For example, other example is in the same classrooms, kids from paramilitares, that it's an armed group, the kids of guerrilla in the same group, and the teachers has to make, for example, grounding rules in order to them to acknowledge what is happening, not like silence, no, but they are like doing tools in order them to make the reconciliation. So one thing that I think that it is very important is to acknowledge this experience for a small, and as there are maybe cases, and I think that sometimes we think it's better to have like a lot of similar cases in order to work in other contexts. And I think these examples are really inspiring, and it's a way of acknowledging the effort of these teachers. Other thing that I saw with teachers, and I also have this tool in order to make spaces of reconciliation in war zones, is to acknowledge this multi perspective about the history, that it's not only one history. There are different kind of perspectives in this history, and I think that is very refreshing to do that in order to reconcile and to recognize emotions. That another tool that I think that it's very important, and here in Colombia we need more of that in the schools, to acknowledge emotions and to focus, as Phil was saying, not in the past, but more in the future of what we can do together, what are the things that we are common with. And these type of dialogues are very powerful in the schools, and we have been part of that. And I think that's better than to know everything about the history of the war in Colombia. And the last thing is that right now we have the report that the Truth Commission has delivered to the country, that was one of the tools that the peace agreement has put on. So we are not going to go back to the violence. And they say something that is very important. It's like reconciliation. It's not only something that you write, it's something that you feel, and you need to address that in the daily basis. So I think that that's how important in the schools and in society in general.
Thanks, Tatiana. Maria Paula? And then we'd have time for perhaps one short comment from someone else before we wrap up.
Yeah, no, so a lot has been said, so I'm just going to be very brief. Maybe I think that it is important to take into account two different processes, and it is like teaching about history and the consequences that it has at an interpersonal level, and then how we move forward individually and in our relationships with others. But at the same time, it's also important to think more at a societal level, how we create a memory of what happened, of the injustices, of the crimes that happen, not to forget them and to condemn them. So I think it's two parallel processes that are interrelated, but I think like something happens at an interpersonal level and something else should happen at a societal level, so that actually we can build more democratic societies.
Okay, Mercedes, and then I'll wrap up.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I think that violence of the past should be acknowledged and dealt with in due time, talked about in due time, because when a culture of silence comes, then after some time, as it happened in Uruguay, it can explode in your face when you don't address the violence that has actually happened. And something that Maria Paula just mentioned also, Tatiana mentioned, is the need for a multi-perspective in history. I think that is also missing in the case of Uruguay, because there is one piece of story being told, but as it happens in Argentina also, not everything is being told. And I think that is part of the problem and part of the solution also, if we really want to have an enduring and lasting peace. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And thank you, everybody that joined us for your questions in the Q&A. Michael was quietly answering some of those in the background. And then for my colleagues here that have joined us, who've been part of the team that brought the book about, for those of you who wrote chapters, this is a great conversation. Just to wrap up and to say something about sort of the next step for this thinking, this work, for the book, and but then also for us at Education for Global Peace. And we've posted the link to our organization in the chat. You should be able to see that. And what really struck me in our conversation is this idea about imagined futures that a few of you articulated, and how we do that, and how that is related to peace education. And, what is it that, students, be they adults, young people, professionals, or pupils in education, right? How is it that they are part of envisioning that future, and how does that then help us shape, the kinds of skills that we're talking about, right? When we're speaking about sort of this content of peace education, how we bring that about. So one of the projects that we're looking at is another book that sort of takes this a little bit further, some of these questions, particularly thinking about how technology and digital forms of peace education either help or hinder or advance or hold back, right? And how are some of these political agendas, this arresting of peace education, as we've talked about, come about in these sort of more electronic or digital forms, and what then artificial intelligence holds for this whole arena as well. So that'll be sort of a project that will be coming together in the future. And something else I'll just briefly say that we've been working on at Education for Global Peace is we've been thinking about how to, this question of measuring, right? And how to take a global lens, doing what Michael was speaking about in terms of trying to understand what's being done and how it's being done and where and who is doing it. And so we're thinking about how to create an index for peace education globally, and then what that entails and what it looks like. So again, if you're interested in any of these, please reach out to us via the website, or you can get in touch with myself. But thanks for being here, and I'll pass it briefly back over to Max just to say a word if you'd like to. But again, thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. The word is just thanks to all of you. Thanks very much to our panelists for a really fascinating and rich discussion. Thanks to Chris Davey for organizing this, and our staff here at IGMAP. I really learned a lot, and I'm now really looking forward to reading the book, which is now going to be jump into the top of the queue of my reading list. I think this is a topic that we could have talked about a lot longer than we did, but I'm really grateful to all of you and you audience members for joining us. Please keep in touch if you're interested in upcoming GMAP events, including more webinars and in-person events. Please go to our website at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University to get on our mailing list, and you will be alerted for a full range of online and in-person events that happen all through the calendar year. So with that, thanks to all of you once again, and wishing you all a terrific day.